Today, we're talking about Rüşd, and it's so much more than just, growing up.
You've probably heard this, right? It shows how we often get the idea of maturity completely wrong. And that confusion is really the heart of the problem. So let's break it down.
So you've got puberty, or Bulûğ, which is physical. Then there's Rüşd, that's true development.
So what exactly is Rüşd? It's about having the wisdom to manage your own life, plain and simple.
And get this, the literal meaning is a path to avoid getting lost. What an amazing metaphor for life.
And this idea is central. It actually shows up 19 times in the Quran, with different nuances each time.
The range is just incredible. We're talking everything from managing finances to finding spiritual truth.
So, the key thing to get is that Rüşd isn't one-dimensional. It actually has 3 core parts.
Okay, so these are maturity in faith, in morality, and in intellect. Let's look at each one. First, you have maturity in faith. This means choosing belief through critical thought, not just inheriting it.
Then there's moral maturity. That's living by a solid ethical code in business, politics, and family. And last, intellectual maturity. This is about making wise judgments and understanding what's really going on.
This concept is so important that its root, RSD, creates a whole family of related words.
A guide, or Mürşid, isn't some mystical figure. They just help you find that potential within yourself. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The whole idea can apply to entire societies too.
Think about this. Ottoman Rüşdiye schools tried to teach this very maturity, not just memorize facts. For a whole state to be considered mature, a Rashid State, it needs things like justice and meritocracy.
So that leaves us with a big question. Why do some nations never quite reach this collective maturity?
Today, we're diving into this really fascinating concept that kind of flips our whole understanding of what it means to be an adult on its head. It's this idea that real maturity has nothing to do with how many candles were on your last birthday cake, but something way, way deeper.
So let me ask you a simple question. Are you, legally speaking, an adult? Depending on where you're from, if you're 18 or 21, the answer is pretty much a straightforward yes. It's a clear line in the sand. You can vote, you can sign a contract, you're on your own. Simple, right?
Okay, but then there's the follow-up question. Are you truly mature? See, that's where it gets a little more complicated. I mean, we all know people who are technically adults, but their choices, well, maybe not so adult. And it's that gap, that space between being grown up and being mature that we're going to get into today. A lot of us, myself included sometimes, make this mistake of thinking that being grown up is the same thing as being mature. But, as we're about to see, they're 2 totally different things. And there's this one specific, really powerful term that helps us get to that deeper level of competence. And this verse from the Quran just cuts right to the chase. It makes this incredibly important distinction. It's saying, look, a person can reach physical adulthood, what it calls marriageable age, but still not have Rüşd, that true maturity you need to actually handle your own business. And this chart just lays it out perfectly. On one hand, you've got Bulûğ. Think puberty. It's all physical, it's biological, it's an age-based milestone. But on the other side, you have Rüşd, and that is all about competence. It's intellectual, it's moral, and it's about whether you can genuinely manage your own life. So, one is just a stage you pass through, the other is a state you have to achieve. So, let's really dig in here. What in the world is Rüşd? Well, the best way to understand it is to look at the word's original meaning, which honestly paints a really powerful picture. Just think about that metaphor for a second. Imagine your life is a journey, and you're traveling through this vast, sometimes confusing desert. Rüşd isn't just about getting older on that journey. It's about having that internal compass, that sense of direction, to find and stick to the right path so you don't get lost.
So here's the bottom line. Becoming Rashid, or achieving Rüşd, isn't just about being bigger or older. It means you've actually found your way. You have this sort of mental and moral clarity that's guiding your every move.
And this idea is just so rich with meaning. In the Quran, it's used to talk about everything from literally finding the right path to making good, sound decisions. It's about being able to tell right from wrong. And ultimately, it's about grasping a deeper kind of wisdom, understanding the why behind what's happening in your life.
Okay, so if Rüşd is the goal, how in the world do you get there? Well, it turns out it's not just one thing. It's more like a combination of 3 essential pillars that have to stand together. And here they are. To be truly mature, to be Rashid, you need to bring these 3 elements together.
It all starts with Vahiy, or having correct knowledge, getting the right info. Then you have to process that information through Sam Akl, or sound reason. And finally, all that has to show up in Doru Davranish, or right conduct. It's this perfect blend of knowing, thinking, and doing. You absolutely need all three. If one is missing, the whole thing falls apart.
Now, what's really cool is that this idea doesn't just stop with us as individuals. You can actually scale this whole concept of Rüşd up to look at the maturity of, say, an institution or even a whole country.
Yeah, the idea is that just like a person can be immature, a whole group of people or a system can be immature too. And there's actually a history of applying this idea, especially in education, where the goal wasn't just to teach facts, but to guide students toward genuine maturity.
So historically, they really put this into practice. The Ottoman Empire, for example, had these Rüşdiye schools, and their whole purpose was to help students build this intellectual and moral competence. And then if you scale that up even more, you get the idea of a Rashid State, a mature state. And that's a state that has found its way by building itself on core principles like justice and putting the best people in charge, and of course, the rule of law.
Okay, so let's bring this all back home, back to us. How can we think about our own personal journey toward Rüşd? Well, the source breaks it down into 3 really practical areas we can look at for our own development.
So you can think of your journey to personal maturity in these 3 key categories. At the foundation, you've got doctrinal maturity. That's your core beliefs, your worldview. And that's supported by moral maturity, which is all about your ethics, and intellectual maturity, which is what drives your decisions. The point is, they all have to be working together. So what does that actually look like? Well, doctrinal maturity means your beliefs are really yours. You've thought about them, you've questioned them, you haven't just inherited them. Moral maturity is about integrity, acting ethically in your business, with your family, in everything. And intellectual maturity, that's the engine for the other 2. It's your ability to make wise, sound judgments.
So we kind of end up right back where we started, but now with a totally new way of looking at it. Maturity, this idea of Rüşd, it's not a finish line you cross when you turn 18. It's a direction. It's a path you have to consciously choose to walk down every single day. And so the real question isn't, how old are you? It's, are you on the path?
Let's talk about Rüşd. It's this idea of maturity that's way more than just getting older.
Okay, let's start with this common saying you hear a lot, but it's a bit of a trap.
And, this whole approach usually backfires because it mixes up 2 totally different things.
See, on one hand, you've got Bulûğ, which is just physical puberty. On the other, Rüşd, that's real maturity.
And getting this difference right is a really big deal. The Quran even warns about it.
So what exactly is Rüşd? Think of it as total maturity, intellectually, morally, the whole package.
Literally, the word means finding your way through a desert without getting lost. What a great metaphor, right?
So having Rüşd isn't just about being an adult. It means you've actually found your path. The word pops up 19 times in the Quran, and each time it kind of deepens the meaning. Okay, so this right path idea, it's really built on 3 main pillars of maturity.
First up, your faith has to be something you fought through, not just something you inherited.
Next, you need a solid moral compass, one that guides you in everything you do. And third, it's about wisdom, making smart judgments and seeing the bigger picture. Now this is cool. The word belongs to a whole family of terms all about guidance and finding the right way. So a Mürşid or guide isn't some mystical figure. They just help you unlock your own potential.
And this wasn't just some theory. The Ottomans actually built Rüşdiye schools to teach this stuff.
But let's think bigger. What if this concept applied not just to people, but to entire nations?
Well, a Rashid or mature state is one built on things like justice, merit, and real consultation.
Which leaves us with a really big question. Why do so many nations struggle to get there?
We all think we know what it means to be mature. But what if there's a concept that completely separates just getting older from actually getting wiser? So today, we're going to dive deep into this powerful idea of Rüşd, a term that might just change how you think about what it really means to grow up.
Huh. Does this sound familiar to anyone? It's a pretty common idea, right? This belief that a huge life event, like getting married, is somehow going to magically flip a switch and cure immaturity. But our source material says this is a huge mistake, one that usually just creates even more problems. So what's the piece of the puzzle that's missing here? Well, it all boils down to a distinction that we, frankly, almost always overlook.
There is a massive difference between being a biological adult and being a truly mature person who can actually navigate the world. Let's break that down.
So, on this slide, we see the two key ideas side by side. On the left, you've got Bulûğ. Think of this as the biological finish line. You've reached the age where you're physically an adult. But then on the right, you have Rüşd. And this is something so much deeper. It's about being ready mentally, morally, intellectually, having the actual ability to manage your life, your stuff, and your choices. And here's the kicker. You can absolutely have the first one without even a hint of the second.
Okay, so what is Rüşd exactly? To really get it, the original meaning of the word itself gives us this absolutely brilliant metaphor. I mean, how perfect is that? Rüşd isn't the destination itself, it's the ability to find the path. It's that internal compass, that mental map that helps you walk through the desert of life's challenges without getting totally lost. You see, a person with Rüşd isn't just older, they actually know which way to go. And if we dig a little deeper, the source shows us that Rüşd is really made up of these four core parts. It's about having a clear direction, it's about the wisdom to make good calls, having a developed mind both ethically and rationally, and, maybe most importantly, having the clarity to see what's true and what's not. It's basically the ultimate toolkit for navigating life. But wait, there's more. Rüşd isn't just this one big idea. The source we're looking at actually breaks it down even further into three essential pillars. Three types of maturity that have to work together to build a complete, well-rounded person. Okay, so here they are. You've got maturity in belief, maturity in morals, and maturity in intellect. Each one is a totally critical part of our development, and true Rüşd, well, that requires all three. So let's dig into what each of these really means. So the first pillar, maturity and belief, is all about how you believe, not just what you believe. And this quote just nails it. It's saying that true maturity isn't about blindly inheriting your faith or just doing what you're told. It's about actively digging in, thinking for yourself, and arriving at your own conclusions. It's the difference between just copying someone and truly understanding something.
All right, next up, moral maturity. This is where your principles really hit the pavement. It means having a solid ethical core that guides you in everything you do. How you handle your money, how you engage in society, how you teach and learn. It's about actually living your values, not just, having them on a poster. And finally, we have intellectual maturity. Now, this is so much more than just being book smart. We're talking about wisdom. It's that ability to look at a situation and not just see what's happening, but to understand why it's happening, the deep down causes and effects. It's about seeing the big picture and making smart calls based on that bigger understanding. Okay, now this is where the whole idea gets really fascinating. The source takes this deeply personal concept of maturity and asks a huge question. What if we applied this not just to a person, but to an entire country?
Just think about that for a second. It's kind of a wild thought, right? If one person can lack judgment or act without a moral compass, or just fail to think things through, couldn't a whole society do the exact same thing? The source says yes, absolutely. So what does a mature country even look like? Well, according to the source, you can spot it by these four principles. A mature or Rashid State runs on justice that applies to everyone equally. It puts people in charge based on what they can do, not who they know. It's a government that actually listens to its people. And most importantly, it's a place where the law is applied fairly and consistently. These are the signs of a nation that has achieved Rüşd. So let's bring all of this back home, back to us. We've gone all the way from personal growth to political philosophy, but the real heart of Rüşd is about finding your own path. And honestly, that is more relevant right now than maybe ever before. When you boil it all down, here's what it is. Rüşd is your internal toolkit for making sense of reality. It's that developed ability to see clearly, to judge wisely, and to do the right thing. It has nothing to do with your age and everything to do with your ability. It's really the ultimate goal of growing as a person. And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. In our world of constant noise and information overload, developing our own Rüşd, our own internal compass to find what's true, might just be the single most important skill we can ever learn. So, how do you find your path?
There's something deeply bizarre about the way human society handles the concept of time and, maturity.
Oh, definitely. It is very strange.
Right. Especially when we look at the 18th birthday. We treat it like I don't know, an engineering tolerance or something.
Yeah, like a magical switch.
Exactly. The clock strikes midnight, the calendar flips, and society essentially points a finger at you and declares this sudden magical metamorphosis. You're an adult now.
Which is, a comforting fiction. We kind of rely on that binary system because the alternative is just administratively terrifying.
Oh, for sure. Imagine the paperwork.
Right. If we don't have a clean, quantifiable line separating childhood from adulthood, the entire legal apparatus just struggles to function.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But beneath that legal convenience lies this massive psychological void. I mean, the passage of time guarantees biological aging, obviously, but it absolutely does not guarantee cognitive or moral development.
That void is exactly what we're wading into today, so welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Today we are exploring a really fascinating, highly complex speech. It was delivered by Haydar during a Friday sermon on March 20th, 2026.
It is a really dense, provocative piece of source material.
It really is. And before we jump in, we just want to make a quick disclaimer to you, the listener. This source material touches on some sensitive religious, cultural, and geopolitical topics.
Very sensitive, yeah.
So our goal with this deep dive is not to take a side or, endorse or condemn the speaker's specific religious or political views.
Right. We are just looking impartially at the philosophical argument.
Exactly. We just want to unpack these critiques so you can understand the perspective being presented. So to kick us off, the core of Kaya's framework is this ancient concept called Rüşd.
Yeah, Rüşd. It is a concept that basically binds reason, thought, and morality into a single milestone.
And he uses this to essentially diagnose a structural rot across modern institutions, everything from marriages to schools, all the way up to the geopolitical survival of entire nations.
It is a massive systemic critique. He takes a sledgehammer to our modern calendar-wreathed definition of growing up.
So let's unpack that foundational difference, because his whole argument rests on separating two concepts that we have completely fused together.
Right. Physical puberty and mental maturity.
He anchors this separation in a very specific historical text, right?
He does. He points to the Quran, specifically Surah An-Nisa, verse 6, and the context here is really critical.
Why is the context so important?
Well, it deals with a highly vulnerable population, orphans. Specifically, the transfer of inherited wealth to those orphans once they come of age.
Oh, wow. Yeah, handing over an estate to a kid is definitely a stress test.
Exactly. Handing over a merchant business or a massive estate is the ultimate test of capability. And the verse provides a very clear directive about this.
What does it say?
It states that when these orphans reach the physical age of puberty, which is a biological state called Bulûğ in Arabic, the guardians must test them.
Okay, so they hit puberty, they get tested.
Right, but the wealth is only handed over if they demonstrate a completely different state, a state called Rüşd.
Which is the mental and moral maturity.
Exactly.
The implication there is just massive. The text is explicitly stating that reaching the biological capacity to reproduce, reaching Bulûğ, it does not automatically grant you access to financial or social power.
No, not at all. Bulûğ is just a passive biological process.
Right, it just happens to you as long as you consume enough calories and time passes. You don't have to work for it.
Your skeletal structure grows, hormones shift. You are essentially just a passenger in your own body's development.
But Rüşd, on the other hand, is not passive.
Not at all. Kaya defines it as the point where an individual's internal control mechanism is fully activated.
Control mechanism, I like that phrasing.
Yeah, it is a psychological, ethical, and cognitive milestone.
Yeah.
The problem, as Kaya outlines it, is that modern society has completely conflated these two things.
We just assume that because someone is physically large enough to look like an adult, they actually have that internal control mechanism.
Exactly. And Kaya argues that a person can easily reach physical puberty, live to be 60 years old, and never actually achieve Rüşd.
Wow. So they remain, psychologically speaking, an infant.
Precisely.
Think about it like getting a driver's license. Just because you've grown tall enough to reach the gas pedal, that's Bulûğ.
Right, the physical capacity.
Yeah, but that physical capacity is meaningless and frankly really dangerous if you don't understand the physics of a multi-ton vehicle moving at highway speeds.
You need reflex control, spatial awareness.
Exactly. You need the foresight to anticipate other drivers and the moral restraint to not drive recklessly through a pedestrian zone.
Reaching the pedals is Bulûğ. The cognitive load and ethical restraint required to not kill someone on the road, that is Rüşd.
It really makes you wonder about the broader implications, like what happens to a society that builds its legal framework entirely on Bulûğ?
It is terrifying when you really think about it. Our modern systems grant all these privileges of adulthood based purely on biological age.
Like signing predatory loans or entering legally binding contracts.
Or voting on complex geopolitical issues.
Yeah.
All based on the number of times the Earth has gone around the sun since you were born.
So this ancient text is essentially demanding a psychological competency test before granting adult privileges.
It implies maturity is a skill that must be demonstrated, not just a default state granted by time.
And when a society ignores that distinction, the damage doesn't just stay in the abstract realm of legal theory.
No, it spills over into our most intimate social structures. The blast radius hits the domestic sphere first.
Which brings us to Kaya's really heavy critique of marriage. He takes this theoretical separation of biological age and mental maturity and applies it directly to how families operate.
He focuses on a deeply entrenched cultural trope. He calls it an Anatolian mindset. But honestly, variations of this exist everywhere globally.
Oh, absolutely. What's the specific mindset he's targeting?
It is the familial strategy of dealing with a chaotic or, misbehaving young man by simply marrying him off.
Just to settle him down.
Exactly. The family's logic is that the institution of marriage itself, the sudden weight of a household, will act as a magical civilizing force.
That is so wild. They basically assume the presence of a wife will function as a substitute for the internal control mechanism the guy is missing.
It is the ultimate outsourcing of parental failure.
That's such a brutal way to put it, but it's so true. A family spends 2 decades failing to instill Rüşd in their son. They fail to teach him emotional regulation.
Or any kind of ethical responsibility.
And then instead of addressing that failure, they just inflict him upon an innocent person.
They essentially treat a 20-something-year-old bride as an unpaid therapist.
And a residential correctional officer. It's awful.
Kaya highlights the sheer cruelty of this dynamic. The family hopes the external structure of marriage will force internal maturity.
But handing massive responsibility to an immature person doesn't generate maturity, does it?
Not at all. It merely amplifies the damage they can cause. The man, lacking Rüşd, just continues to operate entirely on impulse.
Because his internal compass was never calibrated. So he just abandons his responsibilities when things get difficult.
And the tragic outcome is a ruined life for the spouse and a completely destabilized family unit.
All stemming from this delusion that a biological adult is automatically a psychological adult. And we see this exact same systemic failure manifesting in the educational system, right?
Yes. He points to the modern classroom as another prime example of biological growth, completely divorced from moral development.
What specifically does he point out in schools?
He cites rampant peer bullying, which, if you look at it through this framework, is the purest expression of Bulûğ without Rüşd.
Ah, I see. It's a scenario where a student realizes they have greater physical size or social dominance.
And they use that biological advantage to torment someone weaker, completely unrestrained by any internal ethical mechanism.
Because the brakes haven't been installed yet.
Exactly. He also points to the lack of emotional regulation in schools, students bringing unresolved domestic conflicts into the classroom.
Which sometimes results in physical altercations with teachers over grades or discipline.
Right. So he diagnoses both the broken marriages and the chaotic classrooms as symptoms of the exact same disease.
A society that has just forgotten how to teach maturity, which really raises a big question. Can a state-run institution even teach something as profound as an internal control mechanism?
Well, looking historically, Kaya points out that there actually used to be specific infrastructure dedicated to this exact problem.
Oh, really? What kind of infrastructure?
He brings up the Ottoman Empire's Rüşdiye schools.
Rüşdiye. So the name itself is derived directly from Rüşd.
Exactly. These were essentially middle schoolers, but their foundational purpose was radically different from modern secondary education.
How so? Like, what made them different from just a regular middle school today?
They were not merely academic stepping stones designed to funnel students toward a university entrance exam.
Yeah.
The curriculum was designed specifically to bridge the gap between biological puberty and societal adulthood.
So they were actually teaching life skills.
Much more than that. It encompassed financial literacy, the navigation of complex social dynamics, and the cultivation of an ethical framework required to build a sustainable life.
Wow. They were literal schools for reaching maturity. That is fascinating.
And Kaya suggests reviving this concept in the modern era. He explicitly proposes that the Ministry of National Education should open formal marriage schools.
Marriage schools. Okay, so the idea is that young people would be required to study mutual rights, respect, and how to act as a source of peace for a spouse before getting legally married.
Yes. The intention is to institutionalize the acquisition of Rüşd before granting the privileges of Bulûğ.
Okay, I have to push back a little on the practical application of this. I mean, the idea sounds great in theory.
Right.
But bureaucracies excel at standardizing processes, right? They're notoriously inept at cultivating genuine human morality.
That is a very fair critique.
Imagine a state-run marriage school. The risk is that it just devolves into the emotional equivalent of the DMV.
A bureaucratic checkbox.
Exactly. You sit in a fluorescent lit room, you fill out a multiple choice worksheet on empathy, and you receive a stamped certificate of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, you cannot really mandate a profound moral awakening through a government syllabus.
Right. Isn't there a risk that it just becomes another boring worksheet you have to fill out to get your license?
The tension between institutional standardization and genuine moral development is a historical constant.
So how did people handle it historically, if not through the state?
Well, because large-scale institutions often fail to cultivate the individual soul, people historically sought out individual mentorship.
Like a spiritual guide.
Exactly. If the state cannot teach you how to navigate life, you find a master who has already walked the path. But Kaya argues that this ancient concept of seeking a guide has been subjected to a profound corruption.
Oh, interesting. So even the backup plan is broken.
To understand the depth of this corruption, we really have to examine the linguistic roots of the philosophy itself.
Let's do it. Because the Western concept of being an adult is relatively static.
Right. It implies reaching a plateau. You grow up, you hit the plateau, and you just stay there.
But the Arabic root of Rüşd paints a completely different picture. What is the literal origin of the word?
It refers to a traveler in a vast desert who manages to find their way to a destination without getting lost.
A traveler in a desert, that is a really evocative metaphor.
The desert metaphor is highly intentional. Think about it. A forest might have a trail you can follow. A city has paved roads.
But a desert is an environment that actively erases paths.
Exactly. The wind shifts the dunes every single night. The landscape you saw yesterday does not exist today.
So to navigate that environment requires constant active calibration.
It demands an internal compass.
Yeah.
And from this root concept, the language offers several derivatives.
Let's hear them.
First is Ishat, which is the act of calling someone toward the correct path.
Okay, Ishat.
Then Rashid, which is the individual who successfully finds and walks that path.
So a mature person is Rashid.
Exactly. And crucially, Mürşid, the guide.
The guide in the desert.
Right. And the role of the Mürşid in a desert environment isn't to carry you across the sand.
Because if they carry you, you learn absolutely nothing about navigation. And if they happen to drop you, you just die.
Exactly. A true guide teaches you how to read the stars, how to spot subtle changes in the wind, and ultimately how to trust your own internal compass.
They empower you to do it yourself.
Kaya argues that a genuine Mürşid functions as a catalyst. Their sole purpose is to extract the hidden potential that already exists within the individual.
They give you the cognitive and moral tools to give your own life meaning. But his critique of modern guides is pretty brutal, isn't it?
Blistering. He focuses on modern tariqas, or Sufi orders, and claims that the contemporary iteration of the guide has been radically distorted.
Distorted into what?
Into a figure of magical realism. The source material mentions followers believing these guides possess literal supernatural abilities.
Wait, really? Like what kind of abilities?
Believing they can physically fly, read minds, or even invade and orchestrate the dreams of their disciples.
Wow. Flying and dream invasion. That is a huge leap from just being a wise mentor.
Portraying the guide as a magical being serves a very specific psychological function. It demands absolute, unquestioning obedience.
Ah, I see. Because if your guide is just a wise human, you might debate their advice.
Right. But if your guide is a supernatural entity capable of reading your thoughts, you surrender your critical faculties entirely.
And that dynamic completely short-circuits the process of achieving Rüşd.
Exactly.
It's the psychological difference between empowerment and dependency. Like, think about the difference between a great sports coach and a cult leader.
That is a perfect analogy.
A great coach puts you through grueling training regimens. It's exhausting, but the goal is for the athlete to realize the strength was inside them the entire time.
And when the game begins, the coach stands on the sideline. The athlete has to play.
Right. But a cult leader operates on the exact opposite mechanism. They systematically dismantle your self-trust.
They manufacture an artificial desert and convince the follower that the leader is the sole source of safety and survival.
The false guide is actually deeply threatened by an individual's independence, aren't they?
Absolutely. They require their followers to remain in a permanent state of Bulûğ, physically mature, but cognitively infantilized.
So they stay hopelessly dependent on the guide for every life decision.
Trading the arduous work of moral development for the comfortable illusion of being eternally parented.
And what makes Kaya's framework particularly explosive is that he doesn't just confine this critique to fringe spiritual communities or cults.
No, he takes this concept of enforced dependency and points it directly at the highest, most institutionalized levels of theological scholarship.
This is where it gets really controversial. He argues that this desire to keep the population in a state of intellectual infancy is actively driving the way the Quran itself is presented to the masses.
We shift here from the corruption of the individual guide to the crisis of institutional dogma.
Right. He forcefully condemns a class of clerics and scholars who actively gatekeep the primary text of their faith.
He describes a system where the average person is explicitly discouraged from engaging directly with the source material.
And often forbidden through actual theological threats. The source material cites religious figures who warn the public against reading translations of the Quran, right?
Yes, the translations known as meal.
Mm.
Or engaging with the scholarly commentaries, the tafsir.
Why do they warn them against it? What's the threat?
The threat deployed is that an untrained mind attempting to comprehend the divine text will inevitably misinterpret it. And by doing so, they might commit a grave sin or become an infidel.
That is incredibly reminiscent of medieval European structures, where the Bible was kept strictly in Latin.
Exactly, ensuring the general populace had to rely entirely on the clergy for any spiritual interpretation.
Imagine someone telling you that you aren't allowed to read Shakespeare or a great philosopher yourself because you're just too stupid to get it.
It is deeply condescending.
And instead, you're only allowed to read heavily redacted spark notes written by someone who has a vested interest in controlling how you behave.
When you remove access to the primary text, you must provide a substitute. And Kaya points out that these gatekeepers push the Ilmihal.
The Ilmihal, what exactly is that?
An Ilmihal is a heavily curated manual of Islamic jurisprudence and daily behavioral rules. It was compiled over centuries by historical scholars.
Okay, a rule book, basically.
Yes. And the implicit message delivered to the public is, we did the thinking for you. The difficult, dangerous work of thinking has already been completed by your intellectual superiors.
Swallow the checklist.
Exactly. The public's role is not to understand the underlying philosophy, but simply to execute the behavioral checklist provided in the manual.
But outsourcing your cognitive processing to a manual is the death of the internal control mechanism. It completely neutralizes Rüşd.
Kaya uses the ritual of ablution to demonstrate how absurdly bureaucratic this gatekeeping has become.
Ablution, so the washing before prayer.
Right. It serves as a perfect case study for the institutionalization of faith.
How so?
Well, Kaya observes that if an individual consults the Quran directly, they find exactly one verse detailing the process.
Just one verse?
Just one. It outlines a simple, straightforward hygiene ritual: washing the face, hands, arms, and wiping the head and feet.
That sounds pretty easy. Designed to be accessible.
Very accessible. Easily executed in roughly 30 seconds.
But institutions abhor simplicity. When a process is simple, it doesn't require a massive bureaucracy to manage it.
Precisely the point Kaya makes regarding the scholarly manuals. Over centuries of legalistic debate, scholars took that single verse and expanded it into a 14-volume labyrinth of conflicting rules.
14 volumes. For a 30-second washing ritual, that is a nightmare.
An absolute legal minefield. An individual consulting the Ilmihal must navigate the distinct rulings of the Hanafi, Shafi, or Maliki schools.
Trying to figure out what is obligatory versus recommended.
Or slightly disliked, or what completely voids the ritual.
So a 30-second act of purification is transformed into this obsessive focus on minutia, which really serves as a distraction, doesn't it?
A massive distraction. If a population is endlessly debating whether water touched their left elbow at the precise angle dictated by a 12th century scholar,
then they definitely aren't asking systemic questions about justice or governance or their own internal moral development.
Exactly. Kaya labels this entire framework the religion of the ancestors, or Atıl-Ardini.
The religion of the ancestors. That implies a system ruled entirely from the grave.
It demands blind adherence to historical precedent without active engagement or rational inquiry. It prevents what Kaya terms theological research and development.
By preventing direct access to the primary text, the gatekeepers just maintain a monopoly on truth. The speaker is essentially fighting for the democratization of religious text here.
He asserts that theological Rüşd, or itikadi Rüşd, requires the complete opposite approach.
Right. True belief can't be passively inherited.
It requires an individual to actively struggle with texts, compare competing ideas, and utilize their own intellect to willingly embrace a philosophical stance.
Because you cannot reach the destination if someone else is carrying you through the desert while you are blindfolded. You actually have to walk the terrain yourself.
You do.
This brings us to a really pivotal transition in his speech. If reaching maturity means breaking free from blind obedience and finding the truth yourself, how exactly does the Quran define the formula for a mature person?
Kaya moves from deconstructing the corrupt systems to outlining the specific blueprint for maturity found within the text.
And Rüşd isn't just mentioned once or twice.
No, he emphasizes that Rüşd appears 19 separate times in the Quran, and it is utilized in highly varied contexts that demonstrate its multifaceted nature.
Yeah, looking at the context he highlights, the definition expands way beyond just simple age, like in Surah Baqarah, verse 256.
Right. There, Rüşd is referenced in the context of the ultimate truth, distinctly separating itself from falsehood. It implies a profound clarity of vision.
And in Surah, verse 97, it describes the capacity to make just and correct decisions in matters of management.
And in Surah Hujurat, verse 7, it is framed as the achievement of deep spiritual maturity.
But the most revealing narrative context he cites is from Surah Kahf, verse 66, right? The story of Moses.
Yes, this is a fascinating narrative. It details the interaction between Moses and a mysterious, highly knowledgeable figure, often identified as Khidr.
What happens in the story?
Moses observes Khidr committing acts that appear entirely illogical and destructive on the surface. For example, damaging a boat belonging to poor fishermen.
Which seems totally crazy, so Moses questions him.
Moses repeatedly questions these actions, and the text explicitly states that Moses is seeking Rüşd.
Wow. So in that context, Moses isn't asking for physical age or basic trivia. He is demanding to understand the underlying causality.
Exactly. He wants to know the hidden mechanics of why things are happening.
The pursuit of Rüşd is the refusal to accept surface-level explanations. It's asking why.
Synthesizing these 19 instances, Kaya extracts what he considers the ultimate formula for a Rashid person, an individual who has achieved true maturity.
And this formula requires the convergence of three things, right?
Yes, three foundational pillars. The first pillar is why.
Well, why? Which translates to revelation, or like true foundational knowledge.
Right, uncorrupted knowledge. The second pillar is salam akl, meaning a sound mind.
A sound mind.
This is the cognitive machinery, the intellectual capacity to process, critically analyze, and synthesize that foundational knowledge.
And the third?
The third pillar is dodru davranish, or right behavior. This represents the moral courage and ethical framework required to manifest that process knowledge through tangible actions in the real world.
Okay, so true knowledge, sound mind, and right behavior. And those three pillars cannot operate in isolation, can they?
No, if an individual possesses true knowledge, why, but lacks the sound mind to process it, that knowledge is inert.
It just becomes trivia. You're essentially a parrot reciting a textbook without comprehension.
Exactly. Conversely, if someone possesses a razor-sharp sound mind, but lacks right behavior and moral grounding,
they just become a highly effective manipulator, or a really cynical intellectual. True Rüşd is the active, lived harmony of all three pillars.
It highlights that maturity is an active pursuit, an engine driven by the relentless questioning of causality that Moses demonstrated.
Now, I have to raise a philosophical challenge here for you, the listener, specifically regarding that second pillar, the requirement of a sound mind.
It is a difficult requirement in today's world.
Because we currently exist in a digital ecosystem governed by algorithmic echo chambers, weaponized disinformation, hyper-realistic deepfakes.
The information environment is explicitly engineered by multi-billion-dollar corporations to bypass our logical processing.
Yes. It's designed to trigger our primal emotional responses. So if the environment we are embedded in is actively trying to distort our perception of reality, how do you even diagnose whether your own mind is sound?
That is the defining cognitive dilemma of our time.
Can an individual achieve Rüşd if the magnetic field itself is being manipulated?
Returning to the desert metaphor, it is as if the desert you are navigating is constantly projecting sophisticated mirages tailored specifically to your individual fears and desires.
Oh, that's a terrifying thought.
Trusting your internal compass becomes incredibly difficult under those conditions. In this context, Achieving Rüşd demands severe media literacy.
An intense awareness of one's own psychological biases.
And the humility to ruthlessly interrogate deeply held assumptions. Achieving maturity today is an act of profound cognitive resistance.
An act of profound cognitive resistance against an environment designed to keep us in a state of impulsive, reactive bulûğ. That realization perfectly sets the stage for Kaya's final and maybe most provocative leap.
The transition from the micro to the macro.
Exactly. He takes this intensely personal framework of cognitive resistance and moral maturity, and he scales it up to the geopolitical reality of the state.
The scope of the argument expands dramatically here. Kaya asserts that administrative bodies, entire societies, and sovereign states also possess, or crucially lack, a state of Rüşd.
And he makes this incredibly bold geopolitical statement. He says, there are no Islamic countries. There are only countries where Muslims live.
It is a severe distinction between the demographics of a population and the ethical maturity of its governance.
Just because a majority of citizens adhere to a faith does not guarantee that the state apparatus reflects the mature principles of that faith.
Kaya is arguing that the vast majority of these nations have completely failed to reach their systemic Rüşd.
So they operate as massive biological entities that have reached Bulûğ.
Right, they have physical borders, populations, militaries. But they entirely lack the internal control mechanism required of a mature state.
He actually outlines specific criteria for a state to be considered Rashid or mature.
Right.
4 pillars, right?
Yes. First, absolute justice.
Meaning an impartial legal system that applies equally to everyone, not just a tiered system protecting the wealthy.
Second, a system based entirely on merit or liyakat.
Right. Appointing people based on competence, explicitly rejecting nepotism.
Third is governance by consultation, or istishar. A framework where decisions are rigorously debated by qualified minds rather than dictated impulsively by an autocrat.
And finally, the proper execution of fundamental human rights and laws. So those 4 pillars, justice, merit, consultation, and rights, are the markers of adult governance.
And when a nation fails to cultivate these pillars, it operates in a state of geopolitical immaturity.
The consequences of which are devastating, aren't they?
Because these nations lack the foundational internal strength of Rüşd, their systems are inherently corrupt, impulsive, and fragile.
And that systemic fragility leads directly to vulnerability on the global stage.
Exactly.
Kaya points out that foreign powers from 10,000 kilometers away can easily invade, oppress populations, bomb cities, and establish permanent footholds.
And they can accomplish this without ever facing an organized, mature, unified opposition. The systemic failure invites exploitation.
It's incredible how he connects this all together. He is attributing modern geopolitical vulnerability not just to a lack of military hardware, but to a profound moral and intellectual software failure.
A nation can purchase the most advanced fighter jets on the market, but if the military and government are governed by nepotism rather than meritocracy, the state remains an infant.
A state that does not practice justice behaves like an impulsive child in a room full of seasoned con artists. It just leaves itself completely exposed to manipulation by more organized, mature global powers.
The scale of this argument is staggering.
It really is. You can draw a direct, unbroken line from a father who decides to marry off his chaotic son without teaching him responsibility.
Straight up through the educational systems and petrified religious institutions.
Straight up to a nation's catastrophic inability to defend its own borders. He is presenting a unified theory here. A nation is nothing more than a macro reflection of the Rüşd, or lack thereof, of its citizens.
The societal rot begins in the family unit, is normalized by institutions that prefer compliance over thought, and ultimately manifests as the collapse of the state apparatus.
Wow. Let's just recap the incredible journey we've been on today. The core of Kaya's argument is that physical puberty, Bulûğ, is a biological inevitability, but mental and moral maturity, Rüşd, is a relentless, active pursuit.
We explored how the failure to cultivate that internal control mechanism damages marriages and turns classrooms into battlegrounds.
We examined the linguistic roots of the desert traveler, exposing the dangers of surrendering our free will to false guides and dead scholars who demand blind obedience.
We looked at the 3 pillars of true maturity: foundational knowledge, a critically sound mind, and unwavering moral action.
And finally, we scaled that framework up to understand how the collective maturity of a state determines its survival against geopolitical exploitation. The framework really categorizes Rüşd into 3 actionable domains, doesn't it?
Yes. Theological Rüşd, demanding critical thinking and belief. Moral Rüşd, requiring ethical application in daily life, and mental rüşd, the capacity to make wise, causality-driven decisions.
So addressing you directly, the listener, look at your own life. Evaluate the major decisions you are making regarding your career, your relationships, and your civic engagement.
Are those decisions truly driven by your own sound mind and active research?
Or are you operating on the modern equivalent of the religion of the ancestors? Passively executing the corporate, social, or familial scripts handed down to you without question. Have you activated your internal control mechanism, or are you just relying on time to mimic maturity?
If there is one image to hold on to from this framework, it is the linguistic root of Rüşd, the traveler navigating the vast desert.
And here's the catch.
The desert is not a static environment. The dunes shift constantly with the wind. The landscape of truth, technology, and society is violently, continuously changing.
It really is.
Therefore, Rüşd isn't a destination you reach, plant a flag in, and consider complete. Perhaps true maturity is the exhausting, relentless, daily practice of waking up and intentionally reorienting your compass against the shifting sands.
The environment will constantly attempt to disorient you. The question is whether you are ready to walk the terrain yourself. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take care.
This submitted material is a transcript of a sermon exploring the multifaceted concept of Rüşd, or intellectual and moral maturity, contrasting it with mere physical adulthood and applying it to personal, societal, and state levels. As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that society fatally confuses physical age with mental maturity.
That makes sense, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion, like prioritizing the practical application over the theological definition initially?
Oh, interesting. Like, you mean changing how the audience actually enters the piece?
Yeah, exactly. The opening establishes a solid textual and theological foundation, but bringing the relatable, real-world stakes to the forefront would hook the audience much faster.
Right, because right now, it kind of starts with the traditional prayers and then cites Surah An-Nisa verse 6, right? The one about orphans?
Right, it does. And the weakness there is that the most compelling and, relatable hook of the entire piece is buried. I mean, this tragic societal mistake of confusing physical puberty, Bulûğ, with mental maturity, Rüşd, is buried several paragraphs deep.
Yeah, it really takes a minute to get there.
It does. The material waits entirely too long to introduce the devastating real-world consequences of this misunderstanding. And doing that risks audience disengagement during those initial theoretical definitions.
I totally see that. If I'm listening to a sermon and it's just theory up front, I might, tune out before we get to the good stuff.
Exactly. You want to grab them immediately. So the suggestion is to invert the opening structure, to lead with the societal problem first, and then introduce the Quranic verse, Nisa 6, as the divine solution to that exact recognizable problem.
Okay, I like the sound of that. So what would that look like in practice, like a concrete example?
Well, you could start immediately with that provocative Anatolian saying mentioned in the text.
Oh, right, the one about the naughty kid?
Yeah, he's very naughty. Let's marry him off so he settles down. I mean,
It's such a classic line. Everyone knows someone who thought like that.
Exactly. It's instantly familiar. So you hit them with that. And then you follow this instantly by highlighting the tragic consequence detailed later in the text.
You mean the part with the 25 or 30-year-old guy?
Right. The guy who abandons his new family. You point out that this happens because he was physically an adult, but completely lacked Rüşd.
Wow, yeah, that sets a completely different tone. You're bringing the stakes right into their living room.
Exactly. You make it real. And then you pivot to the theology. You say something like, this tragedy happens because we confuse Bulûğ with Rüşd, a distinction perfectly clarified in Nisa verse 6.
That's incredibly sharp. It makes the scripture feel like an urgent lifeline instead of just, historical citation.
Right. It gives the theology immediate purpose.
Okay, so that takes care of the hook. Let's look closely at the section discussing the religion of the forefathers and the rejection of independent thought.
Is there a risk that focusing solely on the flaws of traditionalism might overlook the need to tie this directly back to our core definition?
Wait, you think the author's drifting off topic there? Because it feels pretty passionate.
It is passionate, yeah. The passionate critique of blind adherence to tradition is undeniably powerful, but its connection to the foundational definition of maturity could be tightened to prevent it from feeling like a tangential grievance.
Ah, I see. So it's strong but maybe a bit unanchored?
Right, that's the weakness. The heavy critique against Atal-Ardina, the religion of the forefathers, and that whole lengthy discussion about complex ablution rules in the Ilmihal versus the simplicity of the Quran. It just feels slightly disconnected.
Yeah. I guess when they start talking about the 14 volumes of purity rules, it does feel like we've suddenly walked into a different debate.
Totally. While it's valid to the author's worldview, it momentarily drifts into a separate theological debate, causing the listener to lose sight of the central theme of Rüşd.
So how do we fix that? Because we definitely don't want to just delete that section. It's got a lot of fire to it.
Oh, definitely keep it. The suggestion is to anchor the critique of blind tradition firmly and explicitly within the author's own 3 pillars of Rüşd.
Right, those were revelation, sound mind, and right behavior, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. You want to specifically emphasize the surrender of the sound mind pillar.
Okay, so connect the traditionalism directly to a failure of the sound mind. Give me a concrete example of how to weave that in.
Sure. So, when mentioning that someone reads the Ilmihal and is told not to read philosophy, logic, or tafsir, explicitly frame this as an active destruction of the second pillar, the sound mind, or sagalam akl.
Oh, that's brilliant. You're not just saying they censor books, you're saying they are destroying your God-given ability to think.
Exactly.
You explicitly state that itikadi rüşd, or theological maturity, absolutely requires independent thought processes, like ta'akol, which is reasoning, and tefekko, deep understanding.
So basically, by relying entirely on tradition, you're willingly staying an infant.
Yes, frame the reliance on tradition not just as being wrong, but as a state of perpetual intellectual infancy. It's a fundamental failure to achieve Rüşd.
Man, that hits so much harder. It really transforms it from a complaint about, strict rules into a devastating critique of intellectual laziness.
Right, it perfectly integrates the polemic back into the core thesis.
I love that. Okay, so moving toward the latter half of the sermon. The material makes a strong case for state-level maturity by highlighting how modern Islamic countries face oppression because they lack justice and merit.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of how exactly a society scales up from the individual to the state?
You think the jump is a bit too sudden?
I do. The material successfully establishes the personal dimensions of maturity, but the leap to state-level application requires a smoother conceptual bridge to maintain the argument's momentum.
Yeah, I felt a bit of whiplash there myself.
Right, that's the weakness. The jump from discussing personal maturity, orphans, and historical Ottoman Rüşdiye schools directly into a geopolitical critique of Islamic states is, it's abrupt.
1 minute we're talking about a naughty boy getting married, and the next we're diagnosing international foreign policy and state-level oppression.
Exactly. It forces the listener to completely shift gears from intimate personal ethics to macro-political theory without a clear transitional path.
So we need a bridge. What's the suggestion here?
Build a thematic escalator that explicitly connects the layers. You take them from the mature individual to the mature family to the mature community and ultimately to the mature state.
A thematic escalator. I really like that framing. So how do we actually construct this escalator using the text?
For concrete examples, you can repurpose the text's excellent idea of the ivlik okulu, the marriage school, as the first missing bridge.
Right. The text brings that up, but it kind of leaves it hanging.
Exactly, so you explain that mature individuals form mature families via this marriage school concept.
Okay, so individual Rüşd leads to family Rüşd.
Yes. And those mature families, in turn, demand mature educational systems, like the Rüşdiye schools.
Ah, the schools of maturity. So that's the next step on the escalator. The mature family insists on the mature school.
You got it. Then you argue that only a society built on these mature families and schools can produce a state governed by justice, merit, and consultation. It's Teshore.
Wow. Yeah, that links it all together so seamlessly.
Right? This makes the state-level critique feel like the inevitable climax of the argument rather than just, a sudden change of topic.
It's like building a house. You can't just slap a roof on thin air. You need the foundation, the walls, and then the roof.
Exactly. If the individual is lacking Rüşd, the family crumbles. If the family crumbles, the schools fail. If the schools fail, the state is defenseless.
That's incredibly powerful. It makes the geopolitical stuff feel deeply personal to the listener.
Totally. It holds them accountable at every single level.
Awesome. Well, this has been a really fantastic breakdown. Let's briefly and cleanly recap the 3 actionable takeaways for the author.
Sounds good.
Number 1, inverting the opening to lead with the provocative marriage anecdote. Hook them with the real-world tragedy first, then bring in the theology.
Right. Make them feel the pain before you offer the cure.
Number 2, anchoring the critique of blind tradition to the sound mind pillar to maintain focus. Frame that lack of independent thought as intellectual infancy.
Keep everything tied to those core definitions of Rüşd.
And number 3, building a clear thematic escalator from the individual to the state to smooth out those macro-level arguments.
From the person, to the marriage school, to the Rüşdiye, to the state.
Exactly. We warmly invite the listener to implement these structural changes and submit their revised material back to the critique for further exploration.
We'd love to see how it shapes up.
Until next time, keep refining, keep building, and we'll see you then.
Welcome to the debate. When you hand someone a pilot's license, you aren't just looking at their birth certificate to see if they're, old enough to legally sit in the cockpit.
Right, of course not.
You put them in a simulator. You throw crosswinds at them, complete engine failures, unexpected turbulence. Because, biological age just means they have survived the passage of time, right?
Yeah, it just means they didn't die.
Exactly. It tells you absolutely nothing about whether they can process a sudden drop in altitude, run the emergency checklists, and, safely land that plane in a storm.
Right, because surviving time is purely biological, but successfully flying the plane, making the correct split-second decisions when the instruments fail, that is a matter of cultivated competency.
But when it comes to human development, we almost always just check the birth certificate. We equate biological adulthood with mental, moral, and spiritual readiness.
We do. We totally do.
We assume that just because someone is physically mature, they are magically equipped to navigate the complex crosswinds of adult life. So today, we are exploring a profoundly compelling distinction between mere physical adulthood and true intellectual maturity.
And this framework comes to us from honestly, a fascinating sermon delivered by Haydar in March 2026.
Yeah, it's brilliant. The text centers on a critical conceptual separation. On one hand, there is what the text calls Bulûğ, which is simply biological puberty.
Just the physical changes.
Right. And on the other hand, there is Rüşd, a much deeper, multidimensional capacity to find the right path, make sound decisions, and discern truth from noise.
It is such a vital distinction. The speaker roots it deeply in how the term Rüşd is historically and textually used to describe a state of readiness. We aren't just talking about a vague sense of growing up.
No, not at all.
We're talking about a measurable competency, whether that is the readiness to manage your own finances without bankrupting yourself, or the intellectual readiness to understand the underlying causality of the universe.
Exactly. But how an individual actually achieves this state of Rüşd, well, that is where we find a deep, substantive intellectual tension in the material. Is Rüşd primarily an individual's rational emancipation from traditional dogmas?
Mm-hmm.
Is it an intellectual rebellion where you finally start using your own brain? Or is it, at its core, a guided, structured, developmental process that absolutely requires robust pedagogical and institutional frameworks to achieve?
That's the core question.
I will be arguing that the text frames Rüşd as the ultimate individual, rational awakening against blind obedience and traditionalism.
And I come at it from a different way. I will be arguing that the text emphasizes the absolute necessity of external guides, formal education, and just state structures to cultivate this maturity. Because, you simply cannot reach Rüşd in a vacuum.
Well, let me start by laying out the foundation of my perspective here. When you read this material, what hits you first is a fierce, almost, radical defense of the independent human mind.
He is definitely passionate about the intellect.
Oh, absolutely. The speaker draws a sharp, unforgiving line between biological puberty, which just happens to your body, and Rüşd, which you must actively, consciously achieve. He categorizes true Rüşd into 3 dimensions: theological, moral, and intellectual.
Right.
reasoning and contemplation, and he uses them basically as a weapon against dogmatic traditionalism.
He does target dogmatism, yes, but I wouldn't call his approach a pure intellectual rebellion.
Really, I think rebellion is the perfect word for it. I mean, the most fiery parts of this material are his critiques of what he calls the religion of ancestors.
Okay, fair point.
He openly mocks the way modern believers are explicitly told not to think. They are literally told, don't read philosophy, don't study logic, don't even read the source text's translations yourself. Just read the historical catechisms.
The Ilmihal texts, yeah.
Right, the Ilmihal. The speaker argues that Rüşd is achieved precisely when the individual bypasses these imposed, inherited traditions to engage directly and rationally with the truth. It is an awakening of the self against the herd.
I'm not denying his frustration with blind obedience, but while individual intellect is undeniably vital to his framework, the text clearly outlines that Rüşd is a cultivated output.
What do you mean by cultivated output?
I mean, it is a result of structured guidance, not spontaneous intellectual combustion. The speaker does not envision individuals just sitting alone in a room, rejecting society and thinking their way to maturity. Look at his intense praise for the historical Ottoman schools specifically designed for this.
Oh, you mean the middle schools?
Yeah, but look at what they were actually doing. These were called Rüşdiye schools, which literally translates to schools of maturation. He points out that before a child even reached high school, these institutions specifically taught them how to manage household finances.
Right, practical skills.
Practical skills, how to navigate complex social life, and how to develop conceptual reasoning. Furthermore, he spends significant time redefining the concept of a Mürşid, a guide. Rüşd is framed not as an isolated awakening, but as a heavily nurtured state requiring the right educational architecture.
I see that, but the problem with relying on that institutional architecture is that the speaker views most modern religious and intellectual institutions as massive suppressors of the individual mind.
Suppressors?
Yes. Let me put it in modern terms, like software engineering. The speaker views the individual intellect as the ability to read clean, original source code. The original text is elegant and straightforward.
Okay, I follow the analogy.
But the religion of ancestors, the institutionalized tradition you are defending, is like decades of legacy code. It is centuries of bug fixes, patches, and bizarre workarounds stacked on top of each other by different developers until the system is so bloated it just crashes.
But that legacy code was written to solve specific problems in specific eras. You can't just toss it.
Maybe, but now it just paralyzes the user. I mean, he gives a brilliant, highly specific example regarding ablution, the daily ritual washing.
Oh, the ablution example, yes.
He points out that in the original source, the instruction for ablution is a single, straightforward sentence. It's a simple 30-second action. Wash your face, your arms, wipe your head, and your feet. That is the clean code.
Right.
But then he looks at the institutional catechisms and points out that this simple 30-second practice has been artificially bloated into 14 massive volumes of contradictory sectarian rules.
Ah, yes. The 14 volumes of purification laws.
Right. You have different historical scholars arguing over whether certain microscopic actions are mandatory, recommended, or slightly disliked. The speaker's point is that this institutional framework doesn't guide you to maturity, it infantilizes you.
Infantilizes? That's a strong word.
But it does. It tells the individual you are fundamentally incapable of understanding a 30-second instruction, so let these dead scholars from 4 centuries ago think for you. Achieving Rüşd means having the intellectual courage to delete the bloatware, reject the legacy code, and use your own mind to read the source. It is a profound call for intellectual self-reliance.
Okay, I will grant you that the 14 volumes of purification laws are an administrative nightmare. But wait, isn't that bloat exactly why we need the structure?
How so?
You can't just hand an 18-year-old the raw code of human existence and say, hey, figure it out. You are glossing over the specific triad the speaker builds his entire argument on.
The triad?
Yes, he doesn't just say, use your brain and you will reach maturity. He explicitly lists 3 required elements that must converge for Rüşd to manifest. 1, revelation, which he defines as objective right knowledge. 2, sound intellect. And 3, right behavior.
He does outline that triad, yes, I'll give you that.
And that triad is fatal to the idea that Rüşd is purely about individual intellectual self-reliance. Intellect alone is insufficient. It basically spins its wheels without the anchor of external revelation.
But
Let me just finish this thought. It requires an objective framework of right knowledge that exists completely outside the individual's subjective reasoning. When the speaker critiques those 14 volumes, his critique isn't against guidance itself, but against corrupted guidance.
Corrupted guidance, sure.
Right. He isn't saying, tear down all the schools and let everyone be their own philosopher king. He is saying the current texts are broken.
But he specifically identifies the mechanism of why they are broken. He says the ancestors try to rule from their graves. The problem isn't just that the guidance is overly complex, it's that the guidance demands absolute blind obedience.
Which brings me exactly to the concept of the Mürşid, the guide, which is the mechanism for fixing this. The speaker is very careful here. He ruthlessly mocks the modern corrupted idea of a guide.
Oh, the flying guru thing?
Yes, the flying, mind-reading guru who supposedly tells you what to do through mystical dreams. He has zero patience for that charlatanism.
Right. He essentially says that kind of guru is just another mystical mechanism for outsourcing your brain.
Exactly. But notice what he does next. He doesn't throw out the concept of a guide. He fiercely defends the true definition of a Mürşid. And how does a true guide operate? They don't hand you a list of rules. They penetrate your ego.
What does that actually mean in practice? I mean, penetrating the ego sounds a bit abstract, don't you think?
It means they hold up a mirror. A real Mürşid forces you into scenarios where your inherited biases and your unchecked arrogance just fail you. They educate you by extracting the latent potential within you, breaking down your subjective illusions so you can actually synthesize that triad: revelation, intellect, and behavior.
Okay, so it's a structural breakdown of the ego.
Yes. It is an active, deeply pedagogical relationship. You cannot break your own ego in isolation because the ego will always protect itself. You need the guide to hold the mirror.
I understand the mechanism you are describing, but let me offer a different perspective on the ultimate goal of that guide. What is the actual objective of a true Mürşid in this framework?
To facilitate Rüşd.
Yes, but the goal is to build the individual's independent capacity. A true guide works diligently to make themselves obsolete. They hold up the mirror so that eventually you recognize your own reflection and can stand on your own 2 feet.
But you still require the guide to facilitate that initial breakthrough. You can't skip that step.
Only as a temporary catalyst, not as a permanent crutch. Contrast this with the ancestors the speaker critiques, who actively try to permanently subvert the individual's maturity.
I wouldn't say they try to subvert it permanently.
They absolutely do. The institutional frameworks want to keep the individual in a state of perpetual childhood, constantly asking the institution for permission to think. To prove that Rüşd is an active questioning process, let's look at the textual example he cites from Surah Kaf.
Ah, the story of Moses and the knowledgeable man.
Yes, let's really unpack this, because it reveals the mechanism of the individual mind perfectly. Moses, who's already a prophet, encounters a highly knowledgeable individual and asks a very specific question. He doesn't say, "Can I blindly follow you?"
He says, "Can you share your Rüşd with me?"
Exactly. And what does Rüşd mean in this specific story? The speaker tells us it is the ability to understand causality. Moses watches this man do things that seem completely irrational, like deliberately damaging a boat. And Moses cannot handle it. He demands to know why.
Because it defies his surface-level logic.
Yes, Moses wants to understand the mechanics of reality. He wants to know the divine wisdom behind complex events. That is the ultimate individual intellectual pursuit. It's not about receiving a list of rules, it's about developing a scientific, philosophical mind that relentlessly questions the world.
I don't disagree that understanding causality is the end goal, but look at your own example. Moses still had to go to the knowledgeable man to learn it.
Well,
no, think about it. He couldn't figure out the causality on his own. He was literally a prophet, and his own intellect couldn't deduce why the boat was being damaged. He needed the external guide to demonstrate the hidden variables to him through a structured journey.
But he was questioning the whole time.
Yes, but within a guided framework. And if you want to talk about how this applies to everyday people, Let's look at the speaker's call for modern marriage schools.
The marriage schools are definitely an unexpected modern application of his theory.
They are. If you are listening to this and wondering why on earth does a marriage need a school, you have to look at the speaker's definition of biological puberty.
Right, Bulûğ.
Biological puberty just means your body is capable of reproducing. It means two 25-year-olds can legally sign a marriage license. But what happens when they have their first massive fight over a credit card bill?
They usually tear each other apart.
Precisely. Because they lack Rüşd. They don't know how to de-escalate, how to respect mutual rights, or how to treat a spouse as a garment of tranquility, to use his textual reference.
Sure, I agree with that.
And notice, the speaker doesn't say, let them use their independent intellect and logic to figure out their marriage. He explicitly demands that the state step in, take people who have reached the biological age of marriage, and mandate formal education on the ethics and responsibilities of partnership before they can wed.
Mandated by the state.
Yes, that grounds this entirely in reality. Rüşd isn't just philosophy. It is a structured, nurtured state that prevents us from destroying each other.
But what happens when that supposedly mature, independent individual steps out of your marriage school and into a deeply corrupt society?
Well, that's a macro problem.
Exactly. And this is where the speaker's framework forces us to look beyond the individual. The transition from the personal to the macro level is where the argument really crystallizes. If Rüşd is fundamentally about sound decision-making, logical causality, and moral maturity, it cannot just apply to a single person or a single couple. It must apply to collectives. The state itself must have Rüşd.
And this macro-level application is where the text gets incredibly provocative.
Beyond provocative, the speaker makes the bold, sweeping claim that currently there are absolutely no Islamic countries in the world. He says there are only countries where Muslims happen to live, but not a single state has attained Rüşd.
That is a massive claim.
It is. And how does he define the Rüşd of a state? He uses highly rational, objective criteria: justice, meritocracy, consultation, and human rights. A state achieves Rüşd when it operates on objective institutional competence, not emotional or dogmatic rhetoric.
I agree entirely on his criteria for state-level maturity. Justice, meritocracy, the rule of law, these are the hallmarks of a mature collective.
Right, and this completely supports the thesis that Rüşd is an active, rational framework. It is the triumph of objective intellect over historical sentimentality.
But I think this proves the exact opposite of your individualistic argument.
Wait, how so? If the state has to be highly rational and objective, doesn't that validate the supremacy of human reason?
No, it validates the absolute supremacy of architecture and structure. The text explicitly points out what happens when these macro structures lack Rüşd. Because these states have not achieved institutional maturity, they are entirely vulnerable to foreign powers.
True, he does mention that.
The speaker paints a stark, brutal picture. Foreign military powers from 10,000 kilometers away can come in, oppress the population, occupy the lands, and literally say, I am staying here, who is going to stop me?
And he accurately notes that no one can stop them because the states are fundamentally weak and disorganized.
Exactly. And why are they weak? Because they lack systemic Rüşd. Think about what this means for your argument. You can have millions of individuals who have achieved personal intellectual awakening.
Right.
You can have millions of brilliant people who have bypassed the catechisms, deleted the legacy code, and developed a direct understanding of causality. But if your macro structure, the state, lacks justice and meritocracy, all those enlightened individuals will still be crushed by a drone strike or an occupying army from 10,000 kilometers away.
That is bleak, but okay.
It's the reality of the text. You cannot cultivate, let alone protect, individual intellectual maturity in a society that lacks institutional scaffolding. Thus, institutional Rüşd is the absolute prerequisite for the individual to even exist safely.
That is a fascinating reversal of the causality, honestly. You are arguing that without the mature state, the mature individual is practically defenseless.
Defenseless and incapable of flourishing. If you don't have the Rüşdiye schools, if you don't have the marriage schools, if you don't have meritocratic legal structures, individual intellect is just a spark that quickly burns out in the dark.
But let's look at the actual causality of how a state is formed. How do you build a state with meritocracy and justice in the first place?
through deliberate structural design.
Yes, but you cannot build a mature state out of a population of dogmatic sleepwalkers. The speaker laments that people are told, don't read geography, don't read logic, don't read philosophy. A state only achieves meritocracy when its citizens have first achieved intellectual maturity.
I see what you're saying, but
The individual mind must awaken first. They must reject the religion of ancestors that demands blind obedience, because authoritarian, immature states rely entirely on populations that do not question anything. By demanding that the individual seek the causality of events like Moses did, the speaker is laying the foundational bricks for a mature state. The individual awakening is the engine. The state is just the vehicle.
But a vehicle needs a designer, it needs engineers and factories. To go all the way back to your opening metaphor about the pilot in the storm, you are arguing that we just need individuals who are inherently curious about aerodynamics and willing to question the wind?
Well, yes, fundamentally.
And I am arguing that curiosity means absolutely nothing if you don't build the flight simulator, draft the safety manuals, and create an aviation authority to certify that the plane is safe to fly. The speaker's call for profound educational reform, his praise for the historical middle schools, his demand for modern marriage schools, all of this points to an inescapable reality.
Which is?
Human beings need architecture to grow. We are not solitary processors that just need clean code. We need an entire operating system. Rüşd is that operating system.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground here, exploring the mechanisms of a concept that goes far beyond a simple biological milestone. Summarizing my position, the text presents Rüşd as a profound call for individual cognitive and moral awakening. It is the definitive rejection of dogmatic sleep. The speaker is demanding that people use the intellect, the brain, and the conscience they were explicitly given, rather than outsourcing their thinking to long-dead ancestors or bloated 14-volume sectarian texts. Rüşd is the courage to stand alone, look at the source material, and demand to understand the causality of the world for yourself.
And from my perspective, while Rüşd certainly requires a rejection of blind dogma, it is fundamentally a cultivated achievement, not a solitary one.
Right.
The historical precedent of the Rüşdiye schools teaching children how to live, the rigorous, ego-wreaking role of the true Mürşid, and the desperate existential need for state-level justice demonstrate something vital. Humanity requires rigorous educational and societal architecture to truly reach maturity. We need the right environment to synthesize revelation, intellect, and behavior so we don't just survive, but flourish.
What we undeniably converge on is the sheer brilliance of how this material reclaims the concept of maturity. It completely demolishes the lazy assumption that biological puberty, Bulûğ, is the finish line of human development.
It really does. It elevates maturity to a highly sophisticated, measurable standard of intellectual, ethical, and spiritual competence. It forces us to ask not just, have you been alive long enough, but do you actually understand how your actions impact reality?
And that brings us right back to the cockpit. Age will put you in the pilot seat eventually, whether you are ready or not. The mere passage of time guarantees that you will face adulthood.
Whether we like it or not.
Exactly. But it is only Rüşd, whether achieved through fierce individual reasoning, meticulously structured guidance, or some complex alchemy of both, that gives you the actual capacity to process the turbulence, navigate the storm, and land the plane safely. There is so much more to explore in this material, especially the intricate nuances between theological, moral, and intellectual maturity. We leave it to you to continue the examination.
Thank you for listening.
Until next time, keep questioning the crosswinds.